Hey folks, today I'm going to introduce a strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Go over some themes and those sorts of things. As you recall, I sent out a survey recently to let you decide what the last unit of the year was going to be. And you can see an overwhelming majority of respondents selected The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So that's where we're going. It's a famous novel from the Victorian period in England. I will upload this document, which is going to be an overview and themes, and you can, you know, download it, keep a copy of it, or whatever. But let's just go through these things relatively quickly in a lecture to give you the background necessary to successfully understand and interpret the story. So, first thing you need to know about a story is the author. The author is a guy named Robert Louis Stevenson. I don't know why I put an apostrophe there. Uh, this is him. It's always a good idea to look up your author. I've said this since the beginning of the year. If your story has an author, learn a little bit about them. Robert Louis Stevenson, you can see, was born in November of 1850 and died in 1894. He was 44 years old. He was born in Scotland, and the things that I think are important, I guess you could say that it's interesting that he grew up, his dad was a lighthouse operator, and so he grew up sort of in and out of lighthouses around Scotland, which is interesting. He also was ill his entire life. He had a lung disease that caused him to have particularly bad health and coughing fits. And he escaped into reading as a child and was most influenced by our good friend, an American author, Edgar Allan Poe. He has been accused of sort of ripping off Edgar Allan Poe's ideas sometimes, especially with Treasure Island. I guess Edgar Allan Poe wrote a story called The Gold Bug, which um, Stevenson may have leaned a little too hard into when writing Treasure Island. Yes, but Treasure Island is a classic. If you're looking for a fun read, if you're looking for an enjoyable book, I highly recommend Treasure Island. Great book. He's also famous for The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is what we'll be reading, and a story called Kidnapped, a novel called Kidnapped. So I guess, I mean, he lived a really interesting life because he traveled everywhere. He was sort of, as well as being a novelist, he was a travel writer. So he had bad health, and his doctors told him not to travel, and he was like, "Screw that! I'm doing it anyway." He traveled all over the place. He met his wife in France, and ended up marrying her. She's American, actually. I think she was born in Indianapolis, and she had two kids with a soldier who had fought in the Civil War. And then, he died, and she had moved to France, and he met her in France, and the two of them got married. So he had adopted children. I don't know, his stepson died at a young age, so he never made it to adulthood. Um, but then the girl that he was in love with before he married her moved back to San Francisco, and Stevenson left without telling anybody and sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and took a train across all of America to San Francisco. Nearly died in the process. Ended up marrying her and continued to travel around the world with her, and she was a travel writer too. And so they ended up very happy, and he, for health reasons and also because he didn't much care for England, ended up settling in Samoa in the South Pacific and living there until he died at age 44. So a really interesting guy, and you can see, especially with like pirate writings and things like that, where he gets um, his ideas from real experience. We're going to be reading, like I said, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So we'll click on that real quick. You can see that it was published in 1886. Um, it came out as what's called a penny novel, or a penny novella. Uh, it was published mostly in paperback, and there aren't a lot of original copies left. So let's go back to our sheet. That gives us a little bit on our author, Robert Louis Stevenson. Really, really famous guy now, mostly because of Jekyll and Hyde. The genre of the novel is a little complicated. So a lot of times you can look at like Beowulf and be like, hey, this is a heroic epic. Or you can look at Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and be like, hey, this is a medieval romance. Well, you know, first off, what The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a novella. There's some literary terms down here, and I'm going to go through them with you, but they're all terms you should know that are accessible. Uh, I will, have a terms assessment at the end of this, I think, and the first is that this is a novella. A novella is basically, it's too long to be a short story. It's too short to be a novel. We don't know where to put this thing. We're going to call it a novella. So it's a short novel, generally a narrative prose fiction whose length is shorter than that of most novels, but longer than most short stories. There's no set word count, but a general word count is 15,000 to 50,000 words. The novel, most novels start at like 75,000 words, unless they're mid-grade or young adult novels or something like that, something for, like Beverly Cleary's Ramona series or something like that. They would have shorter word counts. But this doesn't really fit into a category, especially during a time when people like Dickens were writing and they were getting paid by the word, and so they ended up with these enormously long books. Here's Stevenson putting out this weirdly lengthed thing. So it's a novella. It falls into the category primarily of a Victorian crime and detection novel. The most famous guy writing Victorian crime and detection novels, obviously, is the author of the Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. But this fits right into the Sherlock Holmes genre. There's sort of a criminal, and we're trying to figure out who he is and what's going on with that. And the story is sort of the detection of this criminal. And the whole genre came about because as Victorian cities got bigger and bigger and bigger, and there weren't things that we have now like social security numbers and fingerprints and IDs. It was very difficult for the police to catch criminals after they had committed criminal acts, and forensic science didn't really exist, and so in large part, Victorian crime and detection novels, specifically the Sherlock Holmes novels, sort of gave birth to forensic science and modern police techniques. It's really interesting if you go back and you look at the history of that, and I recommend that you do if you have time. That's fascinating stuff. So it's a Victorian crime and detection novel, but all Victorian crime and detection novels actually lend their or go back and their ancestor actually was a series of stories written by Edgar Allan Poe about this French detective named Auguste Dupin. They're really interesting. I'm trying to think. The Murder at the Rue Morgue is like the best one. But if you're looking for sort of something that inspired Sherlock Holmes and that I think is maybe a better set of writings than the Sherlock Holmes stories themselves. No offense to Doyle, I like Doyle, but Sherlock Holmes is kind of over the top, arrogant, and hard to like. Although Benedict Cumberbatch did a great job in some modern Sherlock Holmes stories called Sherlock. They were the episodes are on PBS. They're great. I highly recommend those. But anyway, if you want to read sort of the original crime and detection novels, go back to Edgar Allan Poe and read those things. And again, you can see the influence of Poe on Stevenson. When you read those original stories. Anyway, this also falls into the category of a Gothic novel, and that's a term you probably haven't seen. A Victorian crime and detection novel is self-explanatory. The definition's right in the title, but Gothic novel is not so much. What is it? What do you mean Gothic novel? It's weird because we have a definition of goth that we think about nowadays. It's these people who wear like black and that they're sort of emo looking, and it's a style of clothing that derives sort of from the idea of the Gothic novel. But the word goth actually goes back to some people, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths from like medieval Europe, and the connection there is even more tenuous. But a Gothic novel, the first real Gothic novel I think that sort of took Europe by storm was a novel by Mary Shelley called Frankenstein. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, by the way, when she was 18. Think about that. Yeah, she's your age. Anyway, the Gothic novel is. Let me read the definition. Gothic fiction, sometimes called Gothic horror, in the 20th century, is a genre of literature and film that has an aura of mystery and horror and includes inexplicable or seemingly magical events, death, there's always murder, there's always death, and at times romance. This one does not have a romance element to it, but lots of Gothic novels do. Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights and The Woman in White. Bleak House. There's lots of these Gothic novels, especially in the Victorian era, that were produced. Dracula is probably, aside from Frankenstein, the most famous, and this one fits right into that genre. There was a sort of a renaissance of Gothic novels in America. It's called the Southern Gothic, and they were written much later than in the 50s and 60s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And they're all set in the South. And there's a whole film genre that's sort of based on them, that are these horror films that are Gothic films, but they like take place in Louisiana and New Orleans and things like that. So you can see a bunch of those. That's pretty cool. So it's a Gothic novel as well. And then finally, it has elements of what's called an epistolary novel in it. An epistolary novel was a very, very prolific genre in England before the Victorian era. The Victorian era doesn't have a ton of epistolary novels, but there are still some there. An epistolary novel is a novel written as a series of documents. The usual form is letters, although it could be diary entries, it could be newspaper clippings, it could be other documents. But different chapters are different documents. They might be diary entries, they might be letters sent from so and so to so and so. This actually had a resurgence with technology, emails and video recordings. Like, people are writing novels that are essentially epistolary novels now, and they're told through a series of electronic documents, which I think is fun. But anyway, this novel doesn't start out as an epistolary novel. The first 8 chapters, I think, are just told in the regular fashion. But the last 2 chapters, the most important chapters of the story, are letters from a letter from a guy named Dr. Lanyon, and then the diary of Jekyll himself. So you end up with the ending of the book sort of being in this epistolary format, where you are reading letters. And the fun thing about an epistolary format is that it can mess with time, because you might discover some letters and they're written about an earlier time, and so you can go back and fill in events, especially in a mystery. This is particularly useful. You can go back and fill in events that happened before, and so the timeline of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is all the first chapters just go in a logical, chronological order, and then the last 2 chapters, you got to fit the letter into when it was written earlier in the events, and then the final chapter sort of tells the whole story from actually before the story starts until the end from a different perspective. And that's kind of cool. It's cool how Stevenson does that. So it's an epistolary novel as well. The setting of this story is London, England in the late 1800s. We're talking the Victorian time period. Queen Victoria is ruling England. She ruled England for a good long while. I can't remember the actual time frame. But what you need to know about Victorian England, and there's so much to know. There's a ton of history about Victorian England, but Victorian England was the center of a vast multinational empire. Like, they had conquered. The saying was, the sun never sets on the British Empire, and this was absolutely true, because when you look at the world map and you think about all the things that were controlled by England, it is massive. Obviously you have England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, sort of at the core there, but this little island had Canada, it had South Africa, it had Egypt, it had Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan and India and Singapore and Australia and New Zealand and Hong Kong and Jamaica. I mean, you want me to keep going? This is the nature of the British Empire. It is all over the world. And if you studied England in your history class in school, you would have heard about the mercantile system, and basically the wealth, the raw materials of the entire world were flowing into British factories. And so industrialized British cities became huge population centers, gathered around these enormous factories that were pumping out all kinds of goods. These goods went back on ships and were transported back to the countries where the resources came from and sold to the people there. And so England was this huge central hub of so much wealth, so much power, material, and England was exercising cultural influence all over the world. They were trying to anglicize everything. This time period is often referred to as a time period where there was sort of like a world peace, the Pax Britannia. There weren't a lot of wars, and England was the superpower that was sort of controlling everything. It goes back to this old Roman idea, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. This is the British peace, and now we often talk about nowadays the Pax Americana, the American peace, that American forces who are sort of policing the globe are enforcing. Now, all of this is, we're just saying there aren't any enormous worldwide conflicts. There's all kinds of little conflicts, and England did all kinds of terrible things during this time period. The subjugation of India and the battles that were fought there is particularly horrific, as is South Africa. If you look at the Zulu Wars, for example, and what went on down there, I mean, there's all kinds of terrible things during the colonial period, the period of colonization. And if you're looking at history, I mean, you want to know the history of the Industrial Revolution, you want to know the history of colonial England, you want to know the history of the Victorian period. So there's lots to know, but this is the time period in which the in America we had the American Civil War, but we don't, because we focus in history class so much on that, we don't necessarily focus on all the other things that we need to learn. So if you're interested in history, this is a fruitful time period, and there's a lot to learn. Where was I? Right, setting London, England, late 1800s. So this is a huge city. It was the biggest city in the world at the time, bigger than Paris, bigger than New York, San Francisco. There might have been bigger cities in Japan or in China at the time, but when you look at historical records and population size and stuff like that, England was right up there at the top of the, not only in population but also in wealth. So that's our setting. Next thing we want to talk about in this story is the narrator. The narrator, like I said, is complicated in The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde for a number of reasons. So first thing I need to do is we need to go over the types of narrators. So when we talk about narrator in English class, your English teacher, your professor in college will refer to narrator by any number of different things. I like to just simply say narrator because it's simple. It's effective to me. It's the voice telling the story, so it's the narrator. But sometimes they'll say narrative perspective, meaning like what perspective is your narrator looking at the story from, or sometimes they'll call it narrative voice, or sometimes they'll call it point of view. They all mean the same thing. It's all just narrator. It's the voice telling the story. And we don't tend to think a lot about the voice telling the story, but it's an important choice an author makes. Right? The author has to decide how to tell the story, and that voice is a character, maybe the most important character in the story itself, and it's worth our time to think about. Now, everything we've read in class thus far, except for the Canterbury Tales, has had a very simple view of narrator. Beowulf, for example, it just had the voice of the storyteller. So did Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. There was nothing complex there. The Canterbury Tales took narrator and made it a little more complex because there was the overall voice of the storyteller, which was Chaucer, but then each Canterbury Tale was told from the narrative perspective or point of view of a individual character, and those characters could be complicated. This story is more in line with that Canterbury Tales sort of idea than it is with the Beowulf or the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight idea. So we're gonna, and then when we read Shakespeare, obviously it's a play, so there's no narrator. They cut the narrator completely out of it, whereas in stories, the voice of the storyteller is the narration. So let's look at some elements of narrator. You can actually break the narrator down into like 4 categories, and you can go through and apply them. The first category is your narrator what's called a limited narrator or an omniscient narrator. A limited narrator is a narrative voice that only knows what certain characters or a certain character sometimes know. You only know what's going on in the head of those characters, and a good example would be The Hunger Games. If you've read The Hunger Games, it's told from the perspective of Katniss Everdeen, and so you only know what she knows. She doesn't know a lot. She's very limited from like District 12 and Pan Am, and so she doesn't know a ton of stuff. Another example of a good limited narrator would be if you read the Lord of the Rings novels. Tolkien seems to be an omniscient narrator because he can jump from one character's perspective to another, but the more times you read it, the more you realize that what happens is he always tells any given scene from the perspective of the weakest person there, which is usually a hobbit. So we're always limited in our understanding to what the weakest person present in the scene knows or can see, which I think is really interesting. So he has a definite plan there and limits the perspective. Then you have this thing which is the omniscient narrator. It's quote the voice of God. An omniscient narrator knows everything, what the characters are thinking, how the story ends. They can narrate a scene when no characters are present. They can jump from one character to another. They know what the bad guy is doing. They know what the good guys are thinking. They know everything. And this is the traditional voice of the storyteller. It goes back to Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and when a storyteller would come from town to town and tell the story, they knew everything, and so their voice was the first voice that was captured in writing, and so the first written books have an omniscient narrative voice, and that has changed over the years as people started to get a little more nuanced, a little more uh, complicated in the way that they wrote and understood things. So that's your first binary. Is your narrator limited or omniscient? Your second binary, when you're trying to decide what kind of a narrator you've got, I guess it really isn't a binary. It sort of is for the most part. Is it written in the first person, second person, or third person? Most stories are first or third. There are very, very few stories that are written in the second person for obvious reasons as we go through. A first person narrator narrates from the perspective of a character, but more importantly, you're inside the head of the character looking out of their eyes, right? So that character is going to use I, me, and my. You're going to hear their thoughts as if they're thinking them out loud. This is common in journals, letters, diaries, and modern YA fiction. Young adult fiction oftentimes now has a first-person narrator. Like I said, The Hunger Games is a great example of a first-person narrator. I think Divergent is the same way. There's a lot of modern books that are told from the first person. This actually really took off. There were a couple of stories that were in the first person that were sort of groundbreaking and avant-garde. Gulliver's Travels and Robinson Crusoe were sort of these two travel stories that were narrated in the first person, and then Jane Eyre became a smash success, and it was also narrated in the first person. So they started, I would say, in England and sort of became a thing. Then we have second person. The narrator is narrating it in a conversational way, directed at the reader and referring to the reader as you throughout the story. So you do this, you do that. It's almost impossible to write a story that way. I wrote one short story in the second person because it was a challenge for my creative writing class, but I don't recommend it. You do run into second person narration though in role-playing games. Like if you're playing a computer game and you're a character, people will talk to you as if you're the character himself, and so that's in the second person. Also, if you liked or still like choose your own adventure novels, those are always written in the second person, directed at you. And then instruction manuals are often written in the second person as well, but novels not so much. And then finally we have the third person, which refers to all characters as he or she and narrates a scene sort of from an outside perspective, as if it's a camera that's viewing the whole thing and is not necessarily viewing it from the eyeballs of a particular character. This is the traditional storytelling voice. So that traditional voice that you see in Beowulf and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a third person omniscient narrator. Then you've got tense in your narrator, verb tense. So you have the distinction, is it a present tense narrator or is it a past tense narrator? A present tense narrator, events are happening. They're happening in the now. There's sort of a primacy to them. It's coming at you. The verbs end in the present tense. A good example, I just wrote a sentence. Harry runs to the car and jabs the key into the ignition, firing the engine, which roars powerfully. Here are all those verbs: runs, jabs, roars. They're all happening. They're all in the now. The other type of storytelling voice is the past tense narrator, which is events are narrated as if they had occurred in the past. So verbs are in the past tense. Usually they end with ed. Same sentence in the past tense would be Harry ran instead of runs. Harry ran to the car and jabbed the key into the ignition, firing the engine, which roared powerfully. Can you look at all those verbs and see the differential? Now, again, the traditional storytelling voice is past tense. The storyteller is telling events as if they've already happened. So you go back to the original traditional storytelling, it's limited sorry, it's omniscient third person past tense narrator. Then the final nuance in narrator, and this is a more modern development in storytelling, is the difference between a reliable narrator and an unreliable narrator. So a reliable narrator is traditional. It's when you as a reader can trust that the narrator is a sane, rational, knowledgeable human being and is speaking the truth. They're telling you the truth. You can trust it. An unreliable narrator is a more complicated thing. You can't trust as a reader the information that's coming from the narrator for any number of reasons. I probably should have. There we go. So perhaps the narrator's insane or irrational. If you read Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart, the narrator is crazy. You can't trust what he says. Or perhaps the narrator misattributes causes to events because of a lack of knowledge. If you read, for example, George Orwell's Animal Farm, it's narrated from the perspective of the animals who are stupid. And they believe things that are told to them, but you as a reader know that those things are false. And so the narrator is telling you things that you as a reader know can't be true. That would be an unreliable narrator. And then maybe you got a narrator who has something to hide or is telling a one-sided version of a complex story so that it makes him look good. And these are all reasons that your narrator could be unreliable, and I think they're interesting. And this story has one of its narrators is an unreliable narrator. So anyway, let's look at the three narrators of this story. The story is going to start out in the third person, limited, past tense, and reliable. It's limited to the point of view of Gabriel John Utterson, who is like a stuffy Victorian lawyer. He's going to be our first narrator, and he's going to tell the events as he sees them, but it's not in the first person. It's the voice of the storyteller watching Utterson go through all of this and try and analyze and figure things out. And then you're going to shift to narrator number two. Utterson is going to get a letter from a guy named Dr. Lanyon. And he's going to open it, and this letter is written specifically from Dr. Lanyon to Mr. Utterson. And it's going to be in the first person because Lanyon is writing it in his own voice. So it ends up being a first-person, limited, past tense, and reliable narrator. Lanyon's a reliable guy. And then finally, the final chapter of the novella is the diary of Henry Jekyll. And so this is first person as well. Jekyll is writing from his own perspective. We're seeing everything out of his eyes. It's limited to his understanding. It's past tense. It's already happened. But it's ultimately unreliable because Jekyll, well, I don't want to ruin the story for you, but you can't trust what Jekyll's saying. So it adds a level of complication and nuance to that last account that you want to think about as a reader. So anyway, what are we? We're about a half an hour. So I'm going to try and get these themes through here in the next 10, 15 minutes so I don't have a overly long introductory video for you. But hopefully this is helpful and you're starting to understand some of the things that are going on. So the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is sort of about, I would say, three primary things. Plenty more. If you took a different teacher's class, they might tell you different things entirely. But the themes that I'm looking at are the balance of the human soul, the effects of anonymity, and the influence of civilization on human nature. So let's start with number one. The balance of the human soul. So Stevenson, through the story itself, is trying to weigh in on the idea, the age-old idea, is humanity at its core good or evil? At the end of the day, are we as human beings inherently good, or are we inherently selfish and evil? Do we want to naturally help people, or is that something that we learn? Are we naturally self-centered and only focused on ourselves? And he's not dealing with the physical. He's dealing with the emotional, the human soul. The Victorian idea, the Victorian psychological idea, and we'll get down to that, is really that the body and soul are two separate entities. And he's dealing with that internal one. So he's going to try and weigh in. And I don't want to spoil the story by getting into his views. We'll talk about those at the end. But as you read this story, you want to think about what Stevenson's final judgment and idea is about the human soul. Are we inherently good, or are we inherently evil? Um, yeah, I'll just stop there. A lot of these themes, by the way, they come out in the final chapters. Um, it starts out as a crime and detection novel, and we're trying to figure out what's going on as the story goes on. And because of pop culture, you may feel like you have a good understanding of what Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is all about. But let me tell you, it has been misrepresented in movies and in cartoons all the time. Um, it is those none of those are accurate representations of the story itself. They are hearsay representations, pop culture representations that don't reflect Stevenson's own work. So don't think you know the outcome of the story when you start the story. You may know like the general idea or the general overview of it, but like I said, when you get down to the ending of the story, once the crime and detection part is over and you're getting the thoughts of Jekyll himself, you start getting into all of this complicated philosophical, really fascinating stuff. And again, at the core, it's about the balance of the human soul and what human beings are inherently. Next, we'll talk about the effects of anonymity. Anonymity, the root word of that is anonymous, and anonymity, the idea is basically this is tied into the crime and detection genre. This is a Victorian novel. There were no IDs. There were no government identification numbers. There were no fingerprints. There was no DNA evidence. Nothing that exists now in the realm of crime fighting existed back then. And England was adjusting. The British Empire was adjusting as a society. Back in the day, you came from a town and everybody knew you. Everybody knew your parents. Everybody knew your grandparents. By virtue of your name, you were connected with a long line of history, and you were inescapably part of that community. As enormous cities started to appear and the agricultural lifestyle started to diminish, these cities became population centers of people coming from all over England. And then people from England would go to places like Australia or India or whatever. And when you arrive there, you don't have any history built in. It's a fresh start, it's a clean slate. And that's both exciting and allows you to overcome any difficulties that you might have, but it's also incredibly liberating, and this can be good or bad. For example, if I murdered somebody and then I changed my name and got on a boat and sailed to India, I could live my entire life and never be found out for the crime that I committed. And so this idea of anonymity, that you how do I want to say this? Let's rewind a little bit. The bigger the city, the bigger the population center, the less, and this is sort of oxymoronic or paradoxical, the less you matter as an individual. You're in a bigger society, but you're more alone, right? So think about it this way. At Brentsville District High School, there are not a ton of people. And so you walk down the halls and you know almost everybody. But some of you are all going off to college next year, and the college might be, I don't know, Virginia Tech. And so, at Brentsville, we got what, like 1,300 students? At Virginia Tech, they have, in fact, let me go find out. I'm curious how many students they have. 30,000, about 30,000 students. So you go from being sort of a big fish in a little pond to an ocean where nobody knows you, where you are used to attending classes that have 30 or fewer students in it, and then all of a sudden you're in a class of 150, where your professor knows you about as well as a number, right? And so all of a sudden you're sort of anonymous. You've lost, and then imagine going from there to, I don't know, being in a stadium at a Washington football team game. How many people in that stadium know you? And so the bigger and bigger the population center you're entered into, the less and less connected you are to the overall community. Right. And so the idea here is that eventually you sort of become anonymous. And when you become anonymous, you are no longer held responsible for your actions because nobody can tell that you're the one who has taken those actions. And this allows us to actually be more selfish. because we have no responsibility to the community that we are now a member of. And that's something that this novella is going to look at and consider, the effects of increased population and anonymity within cities and things like that. Remember, it takes place in London. Finally, and this is a sort of an connected theme, is the influence of quote unquote civilization on human nature. So one of the explorations of the balance of the human soul is whether human beings are born good or whether human beings are born evil, or born selfish. I don't know if you want to say evil. But the question is, how does civilization change or guide us along our trajectory moving out from this? If, for example, human beings are born good, then is evil outcome of the influence of society on human nature? For example, if we have a good nature, but then we grow up, and as we're growing up, we see that people that cheat and lie and steal and are lazy and are hateful and manipulative, these people advance in society. Do we learn those behaviors and start emulating them? Or also, like if we exist in a society where temptations aren't there, like you're in a smaller community, a more limited community, you don't have, I don't know, the opportunities for gambling and drugs and whorehouses and things like that you would in a giant city. And so is the civilizing aspect, quote unquote, of enormous cities a moral detriment to humanity? Does it allow us to degrade ourselves in sin, and thereby is civilization actually a negative influence on human beings? Conversely, if human beings are born selfish and evil, the society with religion and laws and consequences, does it force us into being better than our natures would allow us to be? Is it the other way? Is it the fear of hell, or the fear of the gallows, or of prison, or of public scrutiny and what people say? Are these things actually influencing us to be better people? And this is sort of the question of the influence of civilization on human nature that Stevenson's getting to in the later chapters of the novella. So we want to look at that as well. All right, last couple of things, and then we'll call this video done. There are some things that really, I think, influence the themes here. The first is in the Victorian era, there was a major artistic clash between Romanticism and Realism, or sometimes called utilitarianism. So Romanticism, whoops, that's Jekyll and Hyde. Romanticism goes back to this guy named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was sort of a Swiss slash French philosopher who is most famous for his idea of the noble savage. He did a lot of stuff, and actually, if you've been in history class, you probably heard this guy's name. He produced a lot of really, really important philosophical documents. And was a major figure of the Enlightenment. But he definitely had an optimistic view of society and civilization. As you can see from his I guess now sort of debunked theory about the noble savage, the idea was that human beings are inherently good, and that you can see this by looking at human beings in a state of nature. He said, and this is a Eurocentric, problematic theory nowadays, because it degrades human beings of what he would have called primitive races and cultures. But he would say, if you go and you look at an indigenous group of people that are still living a quote unquote primitive lifestyle, hunter gatherers, small family clans and units, you'll find that these people are inevitably good. That somehow being in a state of nature is shows that humans as they are born, are inherently moral and kind and helpful and all of those kinds of things. And so this was essentially his theory, and therefore civilization is a corrupting influence on human beings. And the reason that we have so many evils in larger, more modern, more quote unquote civilized societies is because there's an opportunity for evil that exists there. There's more temptations, there's more vices. You can get away with things that you couldn't get away with. You can shirk your own responsibilities. If you're in a hunter-gatherer group and you do something bad, everybody knows that you did it, and they are going to hold you accountable for it. Whereas in a major society, like let's say you're in a hunter-gatherer group and you find some dead animal and cut it up and try and serve the meat to the rest of your hunter-gatherer group, and they all get sick from the rancid meat that you try and feed them. They're all going to remember that and know it and brand you by it for the rest of your life. But if you're a butcher in, I don't know, London, and you are potting meat and you put it in like tin cans and put it out there, uh, it doesn't really come back on you. You sold it to a tin can company, and they're the ones who are going to bear the brunt of this. And so you can do evil things and get away with it without facing the consequences. And so you can sort of see that this connects with the theme I was just talking about. But Rousseau's theory, his positive theory about humanity, his sort of optimistic theory about humanity, is sort of on the romantic side. When we say romanticism, we're not talking about romance like a romance novel, love and affection. We're talking about idealization. So the idea is that people like Rousseau had this idealized view of human nature, that things were better than they actually are. And he influenced literary artists for a generation. And so the Victorian age is when the influence of the Romantics, the influence of um, his idealistic theories is starting to wane, and it wanes as it comes in contact with a new theory called utilitarianism, and this connects to a literary movement called realism. So the utilitarians, in particular, there's a lot of guys, Bentham, a guy named Hume, John Stuart Mill. They're all people who are essentially, their theory is human beings are selfish. All people are inherently selfish and are looking out for number one. And they'll say that actually it's society that stops us from being selfish, the rules and regulations of society. In particular, they will look at animals to prove this, and they'll say there are some animals that are social animals, and those animals are kinder, more moral animals than animals that don't exist in a society. For example, if you look at dogs, dogs live in a pack environment. They actually could be seen to have morals. They feel bad when they do something wrong. You can see it in their faces and their body languages. Same thing with dolphins. Same thing with elephants. If you see an animal that's living in a society, they're more moral than animals that don't live in a society, like a tiger. A tiger doesn't care. It only thinks about itself. It's never going to feel bad for doing something immoral, right? And we as human beings are the same way. If we're alone, if we're solitary, we become immoral. And it's gathering us in groups in societies that makes us do right because of fear of retribution or whatever. Um, but this is the theory as it applies to Jekyll and Hyde, both of these. You can actually look at it wider, like if you're looking at poetry and things like that, there's a lot of wider applications of realism. Basically, the idea of realism is you want to tell stories that reflect the actual nature of the world we live in. You want to show the ugly bits of society. You want to have unhappy endings because that's how the real world is. That you show the ugliness, and by showing the ugliness, maybe people will decide to change. Maybe things will get better. So there's a real lack of poetic justice. There's a real brutality to the imagery and simplicity to the imagery that's produced. And it sometimes the realism and utilitarian writings offended the Victorian public because they didn't want to see what their world was really like. They lived that world and they wanted to read as an escape. And the Romantics, they took the other road. They said, hey, we want to show the world as it could be. We want poetic justice. We want to show the world as a beautiful place, and we want our writing to be an artistic escape from that world, the harsh world that we actually live in. And so, famously, Oscar Wilde, a Victorian playwright and novelist, said that the Victorian hatred of realism is the rage of Caliban. He's a monster from a Shakespeare play, seeing his own face in the mirror. And he said the anger of Victorians at romantics was that they didn't see their face in the mirror, so you sort of either damned if you did and damned if you didn't. Like, they hated that they weren't being represented accurately, but they also hated being represented too accurately. It doesn't really matter, but I think that these two philosophies are important to understanding the discourse of the human soul and the influence of society on the human soul, and are connected to the central themes. All right, we're at 45 minutes, so I'm gonna zip through these other ones. Next major influence on the themes is Darwin's theory of evolution. We'll talk about this more at the end of the story, but Darwin, his theory is sort of the basis of the scientific idea of evolution itself, that theory of human beings and all natural creatures being subject to something called natural selection. We all have this genetic code, and our genes are passed on to our offspring. And so if you end up having genetics that are favorable, more of your offspring survive. And so over the course of thousands or millions of years, organisms evolve and change in ways that are advantageous to them. And this became really, caused a big stir at the time, and still does, surprisingly, that this idea, because the biblical understanding of the world involved the world being 4,000 years old, and if you follow Darwin's theory of evolution, you end up with a much, much longer historical record that goes, all the way back to the dinosaurs and whatnot. And how does this apply to Jekyll and Hyde? Well, this theory just came out, and we're talking about the basis of the human soul, and we're talking about how human beings have changed over the years from their initial sort of ape-like ancestors. Well, when you look at the description of Mr. Hyde, the antagonist of the story, he's often referred to as ape-like. There's lots of sort of monkey and ape imagery associated with him. And so this question of, is he some kind of a throwback down the chain of evolution? What is he saying about human nature in its earlier forms is something that you want to look at, and it's definitely influenced by the somewhat recent at the time publication of The Origin of the Species, which clearly Stevenson had read. So we'll want to look at that. Jump back to our document here. Christianity's intersectionality with science, that ties in with Darwin's theory of evolution. Stevenson is obviously a Christian, and it's sort of inescapable whenever you read any literature from England up through the Victorian era, that there's a lot of Christian allusions and themes in there, and there's no question that that's going on here as well. What's interesting, though, is that Utterson, your first narrator, is a very Christian person. You can see him always going to church and reading his Bible and all those kinds of things. But that Dr. Jekyll is, he goes to church and stuff, but he's definitely much more interested in science. And Victorian society, and indeed oftentimes our own society, pits Christianity and science against each other in a way that I don't necessarily think makes a whole lot of sense. Yes, both science and the Bible are trying to get at some of the same questions, about life. Where do we come from? What is our purpose on the world? Where are we going? These sorts of big questions. How did the world get formed? And they provide different answers. And so the struggle between the two sets of answers that are provided, I think, is apparent in the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, especially when you look at Jekyll's perspective on the world versus Utterson's perspective on the world. I think some of these ideas are reflected. And so it's something that I think Stevenson wants us to consider as we read the novel. Personally, I think it's an interesting debate because, from my perspective as a English teacher, religions tend to answer these questions in a way that is verbally based. It answers important questions, important truths about what it means to be human and where we came from and where we're going through stories. Whereas science does it in a mathematical way through the scientific method. And so I don't think that there's an inherent conflict between a religious understanding of the world and a scientific understanding of the world unless you're trying to make that conflict yourself. By saying this is absolutely what happened and no other interpretation is acceptable. Um, we as human beings, we understand the world through stories. We always have. We always will. It doesn't matter how scientific you get. Stories help us understand our own emotions and our place in the world. And anyway, I'm an English teacher, so obviously that's something that resonates with me. Um, but anyway, let's keep going. Last one, the developing science of psychology. Victorian times was sort of the birth of the scientific understanding of psychology, and that had a big influence on a lot of writers at the time. Let me drag this frame up just a little bit so you can see the address here. But there's a page here that is worth looking at if you're interested in psychological study. But the Victorians had very rudimentary, very surface level understandings of psychology. It was a burgeoning science, and like I said, the separation of the soul and the body was sort of at the core of the thought process. But they were starting to identify diseases. I don't know if disease is the right word. Mental conditions. Um, I think they would have called them diseases in Victorian times, and that's why I use that word. But they're starting to identify things like multiple personality disorder and depression and schizophrenia and things like that. And for the first time, they're starting to get names and they're starting to get, I guess, attempts at treatment. These attempts are horribly inhumane and awful by today's standards, but they were genuine attempts by scientifically minded people to try and solve these personality disorders. And the idea, I think, of schizophrenia might be somewhat at the core of what Stevenson was trying to do in the story, although it's a very surface level understanding. And then he takes it and runs with it in an entirely different direction than what reality would show us. So, understanding the Victorian understanding of psychology helps you to get a sense of where Stevenson is coming from as he writes the novel. All right, I'm going to shut up because this has gone on ridiculously long, and I want to make sure that you have time to watch it. So I'm gonna stop. If you have any questions, as always, leave them in the comments. I am more than happy to answer them, or write me an email or whatever. I'm happy to talk to you about any of it.